This is a report on a workshop sponsored by US CLIBAR and other agencies on forecasting ENSO impacts on marine ecosystems of the US West Coast. The speaker is Emanuele Di Lorenzo from Georgia Tech and Art Miller from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So I guess I don't have to reintroduce this workshop, but let me just say it was held last year in August in La Jolla at Scripps. And there were several co-organizers that are listed here from different institutions along the coast. And the program organizing committee also included Mike and others that you see here. In the group that participated to the workshop, we had an interdisciplinary group of physical scientists, climate scientists, ecosystem scientists, and also people from the several LTERs along the California coast, as well as some groups from the coastal observing system. And so, as you can tell from the title, the main goal of this workshop was really to understand whether we could potentially begin implementing forecasts of marine ecosystems along the US West Coast in the same genre of how we have routine forecasts of ENSO. And as Mike pointed out, we had several sponsors. And I am trying to change slide, but it seems like it's not working. Let me try again. Thank you, Kristen. Here are several sponsors. We had the OCB, NOAA Fisheries, US CLIBAR, and so NSF. Scripps also was a sponsor partly. We also had some international sponsor from a non-governmental organization, Pisces, and an intergovernmental organization, ICES. So that was very good, and they also sent some people. And the reason why they sent some of their scientists is that also these organizations are trying to create the scientific basis to conduct ecosystem forecasts in different regions of the world. So with that said, the main goal let's see if I can change slide. The main goal of this workshop was really to try to develop a framework for using existing ENSO forecasts to predict changes in societally relevant components of the marine ecosystems along the US West Coast. And let me just tell you why we think this is important and perhaps a mature effort. First of all, we know, of course, that along the US West Coast we have a very productive ecosystem that supports large fisheries. We also are blessed in that this particular region of the world provides us with a rich sets of observations. And here we can list this long-term coffee observing program that started in the 1950s. But now we also have all these coastal observing networks along the coast, and as well as these long-term ecological research sites, or LTRs. And so that's, of course, provides us a lot of understanding. From a forecasting perspective, we now have routine ENSO physical forecasts that are provided us from different modeling centers and also empirical forecasts. And so what we are really missing here is that we don't have yet any systematic or well-organized ecosystem forecasts. And so really the goal of this workshop was to try to understand what would it take for us to really implement ecosystem forecasts that leverage all this wealth of information and data. So with that said, of course, there are some challenges in order to do this kind of activity. And the first challenge that we identified, of course, is to how to bring together different expert groups. And here we have climate scientists, statistician and prediction experts, coastal physical oceanographer, marine ecosystem scientists, as well as, of course, also stakeholders, to develop the scientific basis and also the methodological strategies to implement ecosystem forecasts. So with that said, I will just jump directly of what was the main outcome of this workshop, which was really to develop a framework that breaks down the ecosystem prediction effort, or problem if you like, in a multi-step approach with different layers of engagement and collaboration of a diverse set of scientists and groups, ideally coordinated under a well-defined structure or organization. And so let me just explain a little bit better what this framework is. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework for predicting marine ecosystem along the US West Coast. And this framework really starts with the marine ecosystem component, and in particular the concept of ecosystem drivers. Now, what could be an ecosystem driver? So if you're along the US West Coast, for example, it is well recognized that there are usual suspects of local drivers that are important for the ecosystem. And these can be like changes in sea surface temperatures, changes in upwelling, changes in the currents and the transport along the coast, the productivity, the oxygen. These are well recognized ecosystem drivers. And this concept is important because it provides a convenient intersection between, say, the climate and physical scientist community, and on the other side, the ecosystem and social scientists that want to use information or forecasts. And so with that said, let me just move forward. And so these ecosystem drivers, as I said, are well recognized, and these are important in terms of understanding changes in things like the ecosystem state or ecosystem indicators, which have to be identified depending on what type of ecosystem services we want to forecast, or, for example, habitats. And in fact, during the workshop, we had a long discussion about these ecosystem drivers and their impact on a set of ecosystem state and ecosystem indicators. And so this is, for example, a summary table that shows ENSO-related processes that act as ecosystem drivers. And so this was there was a long discussion and breakout session. And so we think we understand what those ecosystem drivers are. We still have to kind of make this link to the ecosystem services and the proper stakeholders. And so this is part of the work that needs to happen. Now, in terms of ecosystem drivers, it's important to understand that there's really multiple stressors. That is, that the ecosystem indicators and the ecosystem state really respond to the action of multiple drivers. So this idea of predicting the ecosystem, for example, with single indicators, like you may have heard the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index or the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation Index, we actually have to kind of go beyond that, because those are only partial indicators of the large-scale dynamics, but they don't capture the full mechanism of the regional forcing that essentially changes ecosystem, which is a collection of stressors. So with that said, then, the next thing that needs to happen once we identify these local ecosystem drivers, we also have to identify what are the regional forcing patterns, we call them the RFPs, that really influence the changes of these drivers. And these, you may imagine, are well-known quantities as well, like wind stresses or wind stress curls, surface fluxes, or remote coastally trapped waves. So these are really, if you like, what drives the ocean condition along the U.S. West Coast. And of course, these drivers are then connected with tropical Pacific variability, like El Nino or ENSO in this case, and through known teleconnections. Now, another important element here, when we talk about ENSO, we also recognize that ENSO has different expressions. And so really any flavor of tropical Pacific sea surface temperature anomalies that can lead to predictable responses in these regional forcing patterns is actually fair game in this predictability exercise. So this is to say that if we look at a historical evolution of tropical Pacific sea surface temperature, we also have an historical evolution of more deterministic responses in these regional forcing patterns, even in years of when we don't have necessarily a very strong El Nino per se, but even the weak El Nino can actually contribute quite significantly to these regional forcing patterns and therefore the ecosystem drivers. So with that said, these three kind of bubbles and connection represent the scientific basis for doing ecosystem predictability, and so we call this the understanding. And we've broken down this particular diagram in three main steps. The first step is really this link, which is to engage the stakeholders to identify a set of key ecosystem state indicators and also the drivers that are relevant. A second step is to really pinpoint down what are the regional forcing patterns, and this can be done by using regional scale ocean reanalysis, which exists, for example, along the California coast, to identify what are these regional forcing patterns that control the U.S. West Coast ecosystem drivers. And again, upwelling is not just driven by the winds, but coastal remote waves and surface fluxes, they all contribute to changes in upwelling, for example. And so we need to figure out what are those regional dynamics or forcing patterns in this case, because we need to define indices for these that drive the ecosystem drivers. Once we have these two steps conducted, the third step is to use large-scale reanalysis, like the ECMWF or the NCEP reanalysis, to essentially identify how the tropical Pacific controls these regional forcing patterns along the U.S. West Coast. So there's a lot of signals that come from from the tropical Pacific, we need to really quantify the deterministic kind of dynamics that brings this signal into the regional forcing patterns, into the ecosystem drivers, and lately in the ecosystem state. Now, this diagram, as I said, represents really the path to really create and establish the scientific basis for doing these ecosystem forecasts. Once we have these dynamics kind of pinpointed down more kind of accurately, then the predictability exercise starts, and this is step 4, where we can use, for example, the large climate ensemble to quantify the predictability of these regional forcing patterns along the US West Coast. Of course, this cannot just be done through observations, because we only have one realization of the climate state. If we want to understand what component of that realization is really deterministic in terms of this link, we need an ensemble and look, for example, at things like the ensemble mean and so forth. But these are methodologies that are well established in the climate community, so we don't anticipate there should be any problem. Now, as I said, the advantage of breaking down the problem in these multiple steps is that it allows us to really bring in multiple layers of engagement in different steps. So, for example, in step 1, this would be where the ecosystem scientists would have to interact with the stakeholders to really identify what are the ecosystem services that we need to forecast, what are the ecosystem indicators, and so forth. On step 2, this is where the coastal physical oceanographer community has to interact with the ecosystem scientist. And then going forward, step 3 is really an engagement between the ecosystem scientist and the coastal physical oceanographer. And then finally, on step 4, we have multiple layers of engagement. Up here, we have an engagement between people that work, for example, the climate prediction experts and the climate scientists. And these are slightly different because, we have climate prediction centers and people that actually do this with more advanced methodologies. And we also may want to engage statisticians, because not all of these kind of connections need to be based on fully complex models, but there are also statistical models that could potentially be very useful, and so we need to explore that. So with that said, then the question really is, how do we move forward? Because this is a quite complex diagram with a lot of players. And so, of course, ideally, our goal would be to test this framework, implement it, and try to perform some pilot ecosystem forecasts, for example, for a region like the California current system, or perhaps even the Gulf of Alaska. Now, in order to do that, of course, we need some kind of coordination of all these pieces and all these scientists. And so we thought that perhaps a good model could be some sort of ecosystem forecasting research coordination network, which would be essentially a team of interdisciplinary scientists that can oversee the implementation of the different aspects of this framework. And in this regard, one first important step is to identify what those stakeholders are, and potentially the managers, and what the ecosystem services are. A second important step would be to connect with the different type of scientists that need to be involved in this particular effort. And again, here we have the climate, the physical, chemical, ecosystem, and statistical scientists. And of course, this connection goes beyond the scientists. We also need to connect the scientists with the stakeholders to really develop also the proper language of interaction. With that said, it will be also an important step to leverage the existing observation programs that are ongoing, especially along the California current, the California coast. And these are the Coastal Ocean Observing System, the long-term ecological research sites, and also this California Cooperative Ocean Fishery Investigation called COFFEE. And it's important to leverage their wealth of information to sort of integrate these type of pilot ecosystem forecasts also in their infrastructure. Now, the last step that seems important is also to communicate and engage with international community efforts. And here I've listed 2 that were represented at the workshop, one from Pisces, where they have developed a new working group that I believe is joint with CLIVAR on climate and ecosystem predictability, and also ICES, which is the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. This is more of a North Atlantic kind of organization, and they have a new working group on seasonal to decadal marine ecosystem forecasts. And sorry, I didn't mention this before. Pisces here is a non-governmental organization of the North that coordinates North science in the North Pacific. There's different governments, from Korea, China, Japan, United States, and Canada, and Russia. Anyway, so these type of consideration we actually framed as recommendation as an outcome of this workshop, and here is essentially the summary list of these recommendations, which I will read very quickly. So the recommendation 1 is to establish an ecosystem forecast research coordination network that can oversee the implementation of this type of framework. The second, of course, is to identify key stakeholders and relevant ecosystem indicators that we want to forecast. Recommendation 3 is to engage in an interdisciplinary dialogue between scientists, managers, and stakeholders. This could be accomplished, for example, with focused workshops. The recommendation number 4 is to leverage Coastal Observing System Network, the LTRs, and it's important to really integrate these ecosystem forecasts within these structures. The recommendation number 5 is to develop the infrastructure to conduct the pilot marine ecosystem forecasts. And then the last recommendation is to partner with national and international ecosystem forecasting efforts. With that said, I know the report is not in your hands physically, but it's really kind of complete. It will be there shortly, but we did have some products. There was a US Cliver variation winter article that came out with 7 articles that essentially constitute the main body of the report. And this is available online. And there was a webinar that was also conducted thanks to Kristen and Mike, and that's also available on YouTube on the same topic. And so with this, I am done reporting, and I am happy to answer any questions.